The musty smell of old books filled the air as I stepped into the city library, a space I'd cherished since childhood. Dust motes danced in the sunlight filtering through the tall windows, and the familiar creak of the wooden floorboards beneath my feet made me feel at home. I made my way past the rows of shelves, each one a treasure trove of knowledge. But today, my mind was preoccupied with something else entirely. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, and the library was unusually quiet, except for the soft whispers of a couple of elderly men seated at a table in the corner. I tried to focus on a book about local history, but their conversation pricked my curiosity. "Did you hear about the old clock tower?" one of them asked, his voice low and gravelly. "The one that stopped ticking on that fateful night?" the other replied, leaning in closer. "They say it was the death clock ever since." I felt a chill race down my spine at the mention of the clock. I had heard whispers about it before, tales that my grandmother would hush when I was a child, warning me that some stories were better left untold. I leaned in slightly, straining to catch every word. "They say it stopped the moment the screams filled the air. No one ever talks about what happened that night," the first man continued, his eyes darting around as if afraid someone might overhear him. "I still remember it vividly. The night the Thompsons and the Carters. Well, I could feel my heart racing. I had always known that something terrible had happened in our little town, something that had left a shadow over it for decades. My curiosity piqued. I closed my book and casually turned to leave, but I couldn't shake off the weight of their conversation. On my way home, the memory of the clock tower haunted me. I could still picture it, standing tall against the skyline, its hands frozen in time. As I walked, I felt a pull to dig deeper into the past. The thought of uncovering the truth about the death clock ignited a fire within me. Once I got home, I rummaged through our family's old photo albums, searching for any trace of that clock tower. My fingers brushed against the faded pages until I found what I was looking for, a photograph of the church with the clock in the background. I felt a thrill run through me as I noticed my grandmother's handwriting on the back. The night it all changed. It read, but there were no more details, just a hint of something sinister lurking beneath the surface. I couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning. I found my grandmother in the living room, knitting quietly. Her hands moved deftly, but her eyes were distant, lost in thoughts of the past. I hesitated, wondering if I should bring it up. After a moment, I took a deep breath and approached her. "Grandma, do you remember the night the clock stopped?" I asked cautiously, holding up the photo. Her expression shifted, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. "Emily, dear, it's better to leave the past where it belongs," she replied, her voice steady but laced with an urgency that made me uneasy. "But I want to know what happened. There are so many unanswered questions." I pressed, my determination growing stronger with every word. "Some things are best left forgotten, sweetie. Trust me," she said, her tone firm, as if warning me to tread carefully. I felt a mix of frustration and determination. Her reluctance only fueled my desire to uncover the truth. If she wouldn't speak, I would have to dig deeper on my own. That night, I lay in bed, the photograph resting on my nightstand. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the verge of something monumental. I decided then and there that I would investigate the mystery of the clock and the crime that had left its mark on our town. The next morning, I headed to the city archives, a small room filled with dusty files and ancient records. I was greeted by the familiar face of Mr. Jenkins, the elderly librarian who had always encouraged my love for history. "Emily, what brings you here today?" he asked, peering over his glasses. "I'm looking for information about the clock tower and the crime that caused it to stop," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite the excitement bubbling inside me. Mr. Jenkins's demeanor changed. A shadow crossed his face. "Ah, the clock. It's a cursed tale, dear. I can show you some documents, but you must be careful. Some stories are tangled in darkness." I nodded, my heart racing. I was ready to face whatever lay ahead. Mr. Jenkins led me to a back room filled with old newspapers and public records. As I sifted through the yellowing pages, I discovered articles detailing the crime that had rocked the community. The names Thompson and Carter kept popping up, intertwined in a bitter rivalry that had escalated to violence. My pulse quickened as I read about the night of the incident, a night shrouded in mystery and fear. "Emily, you should see this." Mr. Jenkins called me over, holding a faded newspaper clipping. "This talks about the families involved, a tragedy that no one has forgotten." I leaned in closer, my eyes scanning the text. "It mentions a secret meeting that was supposed to happen that night," I murmured, my mind racing. What were they planning? "Ah, that's the question, isn't it? It said that something was supposed to be revealed. But, well, we all know how that turned out," he replied, his voice dropping to a whisper. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The more I learned, the more questions I had. There was a mystery here that begged to be uncovered, and I was determined to find the answers. As I continued my research, I stumbled upon a diary belonging to one of the victims. My hands trembled as I opened it, the pages brittle and fragile. The words flowed like a haunting melody, telling of love, betrayal, and fear. There were references to a secret meeting that was supposed to occur right before the crime, and hints that something monumental was about to be revealed. "This is it?" I whispered to myself, the weight of the discovery settling over me. This could change everything. But as I read on, I found a warning scrawled hastily in the margins. "Don't dig too deep. You might not like what you find." My heart sank. Was someone trying to protect me from the truth? Or were they trying to hide something darker? Feeling a mix of excitement and trepidation, I made my way home, my mind racing with the implications of what I had uncovered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was aware of my investigation. That evening, as I sat at the kitchen table, I couldn't concentrate on anything except the clock tower and the secrets it held. I knew I needed to talk to someone who might shed more light on the incident, someone who had lived through it. I decided to visit Sheriff Hank the next day. He was an old friend of my father's and had lived in the town long enough to have seen its darkest moments. Surely he would have stories to share about that night. The morning was brisk as I made my way to the sheriff's office, my heart pounding with anticipation. I stepped inside, greeted by the familiar sight of faded photographs on the walls, each telling a story of its own. "Emily, it's good to see you," Hank said, his voice warm but with an undercurrent of something heavy. "What brings you here?" "I've been digging into the town's history," I began, carefully choosing my words, specifically the clock tower and the crime that happened years ago. At the mention of the clock, Hank's demeanor shifted. His expression darkened, and I could sense a shadow of reluctance. "Some things are better left in the past," he said, his voice low. "But I need to know what happened, Sheriff. There are pieces of this story that don't fit," I pressed, driven by an insatiable need for answers. Hank sighed deeply, his eyes reflecting a lifetime of burdens. "I was there that night, Emily. I saw things that still haunt me." My heart raced. "You were? Please, can you tell me what you remember?" He hesitated, glancing towards the window as if the past was lurking just beyond the glass. "The clock. It stopped at the moment the chaos began. There were arguments, shouting, and then screams. It was a night that changed everything." "Did you see who was involved?" I asked, leaning forward, my curiosity consuming me. He shook his head slowly. There was so much confusion, so many faces. But one thing was clear. Something was terribly wrong. As he spoke, I noticed a flicker of something in his eyes. Was it fear? Regret? Couldn't tell. But I sensed there was more to his story than he was letting on. "Hank, there's someone else I need to talk to. A friend of mine, Jake." "He was there too," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Jake?" Hank's brow furrowed. "He was young then, just a boy, but he might have seen something, or he might know more than he's letting on." "I have to talk to him," I insisted. "He has to know something about that night." Hank's gaze turned somber. "Just be careful, Emily. Some truths are buried." As I stepped into the town library, the familiar scent of old books and polished wood enveloped me like a warm blanket. I had always found solace in this quiet sanctuary, where the whispers of history echoed through the aisles. But today, as I made my way to my usual corner, I overheard two elderly men sitting at a nearby table, their voices low but urgent. "Did you hear about the death clock?" one of them asked, his wrinkled hands shaking slightly as he took a sip from his coffee cup. It stopped the moment that horrendous crime happened. The mention of the death clock sent a chill down my spine. My curiosity piqued. I leaned in closer, pretending to browse through a nearby shelf. The other man nodded gravely, his expression somber. "They say it hasn't worked since. People believe it's cursed, tied to the tragedy that unfolded that night." "What do you think happened?" the first man pressed. "I've heard whispers, but it's best to let the past be," the second replied, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. "Some things are better left buried." My heart raced. What past were they talking about? I had always been fascinated by local legends, but this was different. I decided right then that I would uncover the truth behind this clock and the crime that had led to its stillness. With a newfound determination, I left the library and headed home, my mind racing with questions. As I rummaged through an old family album that evening, I stumbled upon a faded photograph that caught my attention. It depicted the town's church, its steeple reaching towards the heavens, and in the background, the ominous silhouette of the clock tower. My fingers traced the edges of the photo, and I noticed handwritten notes on the margins. The night everything changed. One note read, "Thompsons and Carters, beware." My heart thudded in my chest. Who were the Thompsons and Carters? I needed to know more. I rushed downstairs to find my grandmother, hoping she could shed some light on this cryptic note. "Grandma, do you remember anything about the Thompsons and Carters?" I asked, my voice trembling with anticipation. Her expression darkened, and she hesitated, her hands wringing in her lap. "Emily, it's better if you don't dig into that past. Some things are best left alone." "Why?" I pressed, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "I found a picture and some notes. There was a crime, wasn't there? What happened?" "Nothing good," she murmured, her gaze drifting to the window. "Just promise me you'll drop it. Let sleeping dogs lie." But her reluctance only fueled my determination. I needed to uncover the truth no matter what it took. The following day, I decided to visit the town archives, a dusty room filled with files and forgotten treasures of our community. The smell of musty paper greeted me as I stepped inside, the faint sound of a fan buzzing overhead. I began to sift through the old documents, my fingers dancing over the worn pages. After a while, I found a folder labeled Local Crimes. My heart raced as I opened it, revealing yellowed newspaper clippings and police reports. There it was, the crime that had shocked our town. I read intently about the Thompsons and the Carters, two families embroiled in a bitter feud that had erupted on that fateful night. The reports detailed a brutal confrontation, accusations flying and tensions boiling over. They were two sides of the same coin, one article noted. Each family believed they had the right to the land, and the rivalry was fierce. As I delved deeper, I found a diary entry from one of the victims, a young woman named Clara Thompson. The words leaped off the page, filled with emotion and desperation. "Tonight, we meet in secret," she had written. "I can't keep this hidden any longer. The truth must come out." I could feel the weight of her words, the urgency in her handwriting, as if she sensed that danger was lurking just beyond the shadows. My pulse quickened. What had she meant? What truth was she referring to? But then my eyes fell upon an ominous clipping, a simple notice from the town's newspaper that sent chills down my spine. It read, "Perhaps it's better not to dig deeper." The words lingered in my mind, sowing seeds of doubt. Should I stop? Was I really willing to risk everything for a mystery that might be better left unsolved? I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the verge of something important. The pieces were starting to align, and I needed to know what happened that night. With a renewed sense of purpose, I packed my findings and left the archives, my mind racing with more questions than answers. As I walked home, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The air felt thick with tension, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than usual. I knew I had to be careful, but the thrill of discovery pushed me forward. I had to return to my grandmother and confront her again with what I had found. "Grandma, I found something," I said as I stepped into our cozy kitchen. "It's about the crime. The Thompsons and Carters were involved in something much bigger than a simple feud." She turned to me, her eyes wide with alarm. "Emily, I told you to leave it alone. You don't understand the danger." "But I do understand." Clara's diary. She mentioned a secret meeting. "There's something important here that we need to discuss." "Not here," she hissed, glancing toward the window as if afraid someone might be eavesdropping. "We can't talk about this in the open. You need to promise me you'll stop digging, or you'll regret it." Regret. The word echoed in my mind, resonating with a weight I couldn't ignore. But how could I, in good conscience, turn away from the truth? I felt as if I was standing at the edge of a precipice, teetering on the brink of a revelation that could change everything. "Grandma, I can't just walk away," I insisted, my voice firm. "I have to know what really happened. For Clara, for the families involved, for the truth." Her face crumpled, and I could see the conflict in her eyes. "You're just a girl, Emily. You don't know what you're dealing with. There are things in this town that should remain buried. Please, think of your safety." "I will think of my safety, but I won't back down. Not now." As I left her presence, the weight of her words hung heavy in the air. I had opened a door I couldn't close, and the past was calling me louder than ever. The thrill of the unknown surged through me, and I knew there was no turning back now. I was determined to discover the secrets that lay hidden beneath the surface of our small town, no matter the cost. I walked through the small town, the crisp air biting at my cheeks as I made my way to the sheriff's office. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows that danced around me. My mind was a jumble of thoughts and questions, all stemming from the mysterious clock of death I had heard about in the library. The conversation between the two elderly men had sparked a fire of curiosity within me, a need to uncover the truth buried beneath layers of silence and secrecy. As I entered the sheriff's office, the familiar scent of old wood and leather filled my nostrils. Sheriff Hank was seated behind his desk, his gray hair tousled, and his face lined with the wrinkles of a man who had seen too much over the years. He looked up as I entered, his blue eyes narrowing slightly. I could see the weight of his past in those eyes, and I wondered how many secrets he held. "Emily," he greeted me, his voice gravelly yet warm. "What brings you here?" "I want to talk about the clock of death," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "And the crime that happened years ago." Hank's expression shifted, a flicker of something I couldn't quite place crossing his face. Hesitation, fear. "That's a dark chapter in our town's history, Emily. Are you sure you want to dig it up?" "I need to know," I insisted, my heart pounding in my chest. "I've been investigating, and I think it's important to understand what happened." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as he leaned back in his chair. "You're young. You have your whole life ahead of you. Some things are better left buried." "But I can't just ignore it," I pressed. "There are too many unanswered questions. Please, just tell me what you know." After a long pause, he finally relented. "All right, I was just a kid when it happened, but I remember that night vividly. It was stormy just like tonight. The clock stopped at midnight, and chaos erupted shortly after." "What happened?" I leaned forward, eager for the details. "There was a fight between the Thompsons and the Carters," he began, his voice low. "A rivalry that had been brewing for years. I remember my father telling me to stay indoors, that it wasn't safe outside. But curiosity got the better of me, and I crept out to see what was happening." Hank's gaze drifted as if he were lost in the memories. "I saw shadows moving in the darkness, heard shouting and then gunshots. I was scared, Emily. I ran back inside, but the damage was done. In the morning, we learned that someone had died, one of the Carters. The town never really recovered from it." "Did you see who pulled the trigger?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, a tense silence stretching between us. No, I didn't, but there were rumors, whispers that it was someone close to the Thompsons. I always felt that something was off, like there was more to the story than anyone was willing to admit. Jake was there too, right? I asked, suddenly remembering what I had learned from my earlier research. Hank nodded slowly. Yes, Jake was with me. He was just a boy then, but I could tell he was affected by it. He never spoke of that night, not once. I often wonder what he saw that made him so quiet about it. Do you think he knows more than he lets on? I probed, sensing there was a connection between Jake and the events of that night that Hank wasn't revealing. Maybe, Hank replied, his tone thoughtful. Jake has always been a good kid, but there's a darkness in his family's past. Sometimes, the weight of such things can be too much to bear. As we spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling that Hank was holding something back. There was a glimmer in his eyes when he mentioned the clock, a flicker of recognition that suggested he had a deeper connection to the events of that night than he was willing to share. I needed to know more. Sheriff, what about the clock? I asked, trying to draw him out. Why did it stop at midnight? Do you think it's more than just a coincidence? Hank shifted in his seat, the unease palpable. The clock has always been a symbol of that night, Emily. People say it stopped to mark the moment of tragedy, a reminder of the lives lost and the secrets kept. But whether it has any real significance, I can't say. Do you think it's cursed? I ventured, half jokingly, but Hank's expression turned serious. Cursed or not, it holds the memories of that night, he said gravely. And memories can be powerful. They shape who we are and how we live. Just then, a loud clap of thunder echoed outside, making me jump. Hank glanced out the window, his brow furrowing. Looks like a storm is rolling in. We might want to wrap this up before it gets too bad. I have one more question, I said, my heart racing as I leaned in closer. Do you think the truth should come out? Should we dig up the past, even if it hurts people? Hank studied me for a long moment, his expression inscrutable. Finally, he said, truth can be a double-edged sword, Emily. Can free us, but it can also destroy us. Sometimes, it's best to let sleeping dogs lie. I felt a mix of frustration and determination. But how can we heal if we don't confront what happened? People deserve to know. He sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. You're a brave girl. Just be careful where you tread. Not everyone is ready to face the past. I nodded, the weight of his words settling in my chest. As I stood to leave, I couldn't help but feel that I was on the brink of something significant. The clock, the crime, the lives intertwined in tragedy. It all felt like a puzzle waiting to be solved. As I stepped out of the sheriff's office, the wind picked up, whipping around me as dark clouds gathered overhead. I made my way back home, my mind racing with the possibilities of what lay ahead. I needed to talk to Jake, to confront him about what he knew. I could feel that we were connected to this story in ways we hadn't yet uncovered. Arriving home, I felt the unsettling weight of anticipation. I knew that whatever happened next would change everything. The truth was out there, waiting for me to find it, and I was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. The sun was beginning to set as I made my way to the local community center, the air thick with anticipation. It was the night of the annual Harvest Festival, and the familiar sounds of laughter and music floated through the streets. But my mind was elsewhere, consumed by the mystery of the death clock and the dark history that surrounded it. My heart raced as I thought about everything I had uncovered so far. The clock had stopped at the moment a horrific crime was committed, and I was determined to unravel the threads of the past. As I walked through the crowd, I spotted Jake leaning against a wooden post, his expression unreadable. I could feel tension between us, a weight that had settled since I started digging into the town's history. I approached him, my curiosity battling with my growing unease. "Hey, Jake," I said, trying to sound casual. "Can we talk?" He glanced at me, eyes narrowing slightly. "About what?" "About that night, the night of the crime." I pressed, hoping to break through the wall he had built around himself. "I don't remember much," It was a long time ago, he replied evasively, shifting his gaze to the ground. Come on, Jake. You were there. You must remember something. My voice had taken on a pleading tone, and I hated how vulnerable I felt. He ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. I told you, it's not something I want to relive. Why not? You might have answers. I felt my frustration boil over. People died that night, and you're just going to pretend it didn't happen? Look, I just don't think it's a good idea to dig into the past. Some things are better left alone. Before I could respond, the sound of laughter drew my attention. A group of people passed us by, their carefree spirits a stark contrast to the heavy conversation. I felt a pang of frustration at how easily everyone else seemed to brush off the town's dark history. Emily, a familiar voice called from behind me. It was Hank, the sheriff. He approached us, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. Is everything all right here? Just talking about the festival, Jake said quickly, flashing a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. Hank looked between us, his expression unreadable. Well, I hope you're both having a good time. Remember, if you need anything, I'm just a shout away. As he walked away, I caught a glimpse of something in his eyes. Was it concern or something deeper? The thought unsettled me. Jake remained silent, and I could feel the tension thickening the air between us. I think we should talk more, I finally said. There's something going on, and I need to know what you know. Jake seemed to hesitate, but his resolve hardened. I told you, Emily, I can't help you with this. You're opening a can of worms that's better left closed. I watched him walk away, frustration bubbling inside me. I felt as if I were grasping at shadows, and I needed something solid to hold on to. Later that night, I found myself in the dimly lit living room of my house, the glow of a single lamp illuminating the pages of the diary I had found in the archives. The words of the victim echoed in my mind, the anticipation of a secret meeting that seemed to hint at a web of connections I was yet to fully see. The next day, when I saw Jake again, I was more determined than ever. I need to know what happened that night, I said, my voice steady as I approached him. He sighed, looking tired. Emily, I really don't want to talk about it. It's not what you think. Then what is it? I pressed, my frustration spilling over. Why won't you just tell me the truth? Because the truth can be dangerous, he replied, his voice low. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into. Neither do you. I shot back, my anger flaring. You were there, Jake. You saw something. I know you did. He looked away, his jaw clenched. It's not just about me. There are people who don't want the past to come up again. People who will do anything to keep it buried. I felt a chill run down my spine at his words. Are you saying you're afraid? I'm saying you should be careful, he said, his tone serious. This isn't just some story. It's real, and it's dangerous. I wanted to argue, to push him further, but something in his eyes stopped me. There was fear there, and it was infectious. Fine, I said, my voice softer now, but I can't just walk away from this. I won't let it go. As days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that Jake was hiding something crucial. My instincts were screaming at me to dig deeper. At a local party that weekend, I noticed him talking to Hank again, their conversation low and urgent. I felt my heart race as I watched them. What were they discussing? After the party, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I needed to see what Jake was hiding. I made my way to his house, the familiar streets feeling different in the moonlight. The shadows stretched long, and the air felt thick with secrets. I knocked softly, but there was no answer. My heart pounded as I pushed the door open, which creaked ominously. The house was dark and quiet, an unsettling silence enveloping me. I stepped inside, glancing around. Jake, I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. I moved deeper into the house, feeling the weight of unease settle in my stomach. As I entered his room, I felt a rush of adrenaline. It was a mess. Clothes strewn everywhere, papers piled haphazardly on the desk. Then I spotted it. A glint of something caught my eye, half hidden beneath a pile of notebooks. I moved closer, my heart racing as I reached down and picked up the object. It was a locket, an old, tarnished piece that looked distinctly familiar. I opened it, my breath catching in my throat. Inside was a picture of one of the victims, a girl with bright eyes and a warm smile. I stumbled back, realization hitting me like a punch. This belonged to her. What was Jake doing with this? Emily! Jake's voice rang out, startling me. He stood in the doorway, his expression a mix of shock and anger. What are you doing here? I found this, I stammered, holding up the locket. Why do you have this? His face paled, and for a moment, I thought he might say something, but he just shook his head, his expression hardening. You shouldn't have come here. I felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. Why not? Are you hiding something? Do you have any idea what this means? Just put it down, Emily, he said, his voice low but intense. You don't understand the danger you're putting yourself in. Tell me the truth, Jake. I'm tired of this, I demanded, my voice rising. He took a step closer, eyes filled with a mix of desperation and frustration. You think you want the truth? You don't know what it's like to carry that weight. You don't know what happened that night. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I stood my ground. Then tell me, help me understand. He hesitated, the silence stretching between us. If you really want to know, then you have to be ready for the consequences, he finally said, his voice heavy with meaning. I'm ready, I said, though doubts crept into my mind. This was the moment I had been waiting for, but now that it was here, I was terrified of what I might uncover. As he opened his mouth to speak, I felt a sudden dread wash over me. The clock was ticking, and I knew that whatever secrets lay behind those walls, they were about to unravel. But before he could say anything, the tension in the room snapped. I could almost hear the echoes of the past calling us, urging us to confront the shadows that had lingered too long, and I couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead. If the truth would set us free or bind us forever to the darkness that had haunted our town for generations. Determined to uncover the truth behind the chilling tales surrounding the death clock, I made my way to the old church, a structure steeped in the very fabric of our town's haunted past. The place had always fascinated me. Its crumbling walls and darkened corridors whispered secrets of days long gone. I had heard about the clock, how it had stopped at the moment of a horrific crime decades ago, and how its stillness marked the town with a shadow that refused to lift. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was meant to delve deeper into this mystery, to peel back the layers of time that my family and the townsfolk seemed desperate to keep buried. As I approached the church, my heart raced in anticipation. I had spent days piecing together fragments of stories, old newspaper clippings, and hushed conversations overheard in the library. My latest clue had led me here, and I couldn't ignore the nagging voice in my head urging me to find out what really happened that fateful night. I pushed open the heavy wooden door, the creak echoing like a harbinger of the revelations I was about to uncover. Inside, the air felt thick with dust and memories. I wandered through the nave, running my fingers along the worn pews, imagining the people who once gathered here. My gaze was drawn to the altar, where the sunlight streamed through stained glass, casting colorful patterns on the floor. But it wasn't the beauty of the church that held my attention. It was the staircase leading up to the loft. I had heard whispers of a hidden attic, a place where secrets might lie undisturbed. With a mix of trepidation and excitement, I climbed the staircase, each step creaking under my weight. At the top, I found a door, its surface weathered and covered in cobwebs. I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing with what I might find beyond. Gathering my courage, I turned the knob and stepped inside. The attic was dimly lit, illuminated only by a small window that revealed a sliver of the outside world. Dust motes danced in the air, and the smell of aged wood filled my lungs. As I scanned the room, my eyes landed on a stack of boxes in the corner, their contents obscured by time. I made my way over, curiosity propelling me forward. Rummaging through the boxes, I stumbled upon a collection of old trinkets, religious artifacts, and faded photographs. My heart skipped a beat when I uncovered a small wooden box, intricately carved and surprisingly well preserved. Inside, I found letters, their envelopes yellowed with age. I carefully unfolded one and began to read. The letters were exchanged between the Thompson and Carter families, detailing a secret romance between two individuals from the rival clans. My pulse quickened as I realized that this could be the key to understanding the tensions that had led to the crime. The words spoke of love hidden in the shadows, of plans made under the cover of darkness. I felt a chill run down my spine as I considered the implications of their relationship. Could love have turned to hatred? Could this romance have sparked a deadly confrontation? Just then, I heard a noise behind me, causing Meu Coração a despairer. I spun around, only to find Jake standing in the doorway, his face a mask of concern. "Emily, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. "I need to know the truth, Jake," I replied, determination fueling my words. "I found these letters. They talk about a romance between the Thompsons and the Carters. This could explain what happened that night." He stepped further into the room, casting a wary glance around as if expecting someone to appear. "You shouldn't be digging into this. It's dangerous. People don't want the past uncovered." I crossed my arms, refusing to back down. "But don't you want to know? Don't you want to understand what happened?" Jake hesitated, his eyes shifting as if debating how much he should reveal. "Some things are better left alone. Trust me, Emily. There are people who would do anything to keep this buried. Are you one of those people?" I shot back, a mixture of anger and betrayal flaring inside me. "You've been acting strange ever since I started this investigation." "Look, I'm just trying to protect you," he replied, frustration evident in his tone. "You don't know what you're getting into. Then tell me. Help me understand," I implored, my voice rising slightly. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, a sign of his internal struggle. "It's not that simple. There are connections, things I can't explain right now." Before I could press him further, he stepped back, as if the weight of my questions was too heavy. "Just promise me you'll stop looking into this," he pleaded. "For your own sake." I felt a surge of defiance. "You can't just tell me to stop. I have to know the truth." "Emily," he began, but I cut him off. "No, Jake. This affects us all. If there's something dark in our past, we deserve to know what it is." He looked at me, a mixture of fear and resignation in his eyes. "If you keep digging, you might not like what you find." With that, he turned and left the attic, leaving me alone with my thoughts, a whirlwind of emotions crashing over me like waves. I felt the weight of his warning hanging in the air, but I also felt the thrill of discovery. I couldn't turn back now. As I descended the staircase, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the brink of something significant. The letters I found were just the beginning. They hinted at a deeper connection between the families that might have led to the tragic events that stopped the clock. I needed to decipher their meaning and how they tied into the crime that had gripped our town for so long. When I reached the ground floor, I paused for a moment, listening to the silence of the church. The atmosphere felt charged, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for the truth to be revealed. I glanced back at the loft, a sense of urgency igniting within me. I made my way home, my mind racing with possibilities. The more I uncovered, the more questions I had. What had really happened that night? Why had the clock stopped? And what role did Jake play in all of this? As I entered my house, I felt a familiar chill in the air. I needed to talk to my grandmother. She had always been a keeper of family secrets. Surely she had more information about the Thompsons, the Carters, and the night the clock stopped. "Grandma," I called as I stepped into the living room. She looked up from her knitting, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "Emily, dear, you're home late. How was the library?" "It was fine," I replied, trying to gauge her mood. "Can we talk about the Thompsons and the Carters? I found something interesting today." Her expression shifted, the warmth fading into something more serious. "Oh, Emily, I really think it's best to leave those stories alone." "Why?" I pressed, unable to hide my frustration. "They're part of our history. I need to know what happened." The clock stopped when Something terrible occurred. She sighed, setting her knitting aside. Some things are better left in the past. You don't understand the pain that comes with those memories. Then help me understand, I urged, feeling a swell of emotion. What are you so afraid of? Fear isn't the issue, dear. It's the hurt. The Thompsons and the Carters were neighbors once, friends even. But then something happened, something that changed everything. What was it? I can't tell you, Emily. It's not my place to dig up old wounds. Is it because of the crime? I asked, my heart racing at the thought. Sometimes knowledge can be a burden, child. You have to be careful with what you wish for, she replied, her voice heavy with warning. I felt a mix of anger and determination, my resolve hardening. But I have to know. I can't just let it go. Then you must be prepared for the consequences, she warned, her gaze piercing into mine. After our conversation, I felt more conflicted than ever. My grandmother's reluctance only fueled my desire to uncover the truth. I had to follow this path even if it led to darkness. With my heart pounding and a newfound sense of urgency, I returned to my research, determined to piece together the fragments of a story that had been shrouded in silence for far too long. The air outside was thick with an impending storm, the kind that settled like a heavy blanket over the town, whispering secrets of dread. I felt a strange mix of anticipation and fear as I approached Sheriff Hank's house. His gray beard always seemed to twitch with anxiety when I brought up the past, and today, I suspected it would be no different. The creaking wooden steps leading to his porch echoed my heartbeat, a steady rhythm of resolve battling against the uncertainty coiling in my stomach. I knocked, the sound swallowed by the rumble of distant thunder. Moments later, Hank appeared at the door, his face etched with lines of worry. Emily, he said, stepping aside to let me in. You shouldn't be out during a storm like this. I know, I replied, trying to sound braver than I felt. But I needed to talk to you. It's important. He led me into his cluttered living room, where the scent of old books mingled with the faint aroma of coffee. The walls were lined with photographs of the town, relics of a time long past. I settled onto a worn-out armchair, its fabric frayed from years of use. Hank sat across from me, his hands clasped tightly. I could see the tension in his body, as if he was bracing for the worst. I've been digging into the past, I started, my voice steady, though inside I trembled. I found some documents about the crime, the one that the clock stopped for. It's not just a story, Hank. It's real. The families involved, the Thompsons and Carters, they had a bitter rivalry. Something happened that night, something terrible. Hank's eyes darkened, and I could see the flicker of memories flash across his face. Some things are better left buried, Emily, he warned, his voice low and gravelly. You don't know what you're getting into. I need to know, Hank. I can't just ignore it. There are pieces that don't fit together, and I think Jake might know something. He was there that night, wasn't he? At the mention of Jake's name, Hank stiffened. That boy, he's been through enough. You shouldn't drag him into this. But he's hiding something, I pressed, leaning forward. I found a note that he left. He scared Hank. He mentioned people coming after him. What does that mean? Hank sighed deeply, rubbing his temples as if trying to dispel the memories that haunted him. Jake is just a kid. He doesn't need this weight on his shoulders. The past is a dangerous place for a young man. Is that why you're so nervous talking about it? Because you were there too. The words slipped out before I could stop them, and the atmosphere in the room shifted, thickening with unspoken truths. Hank's gaze hardened. That's not what this is about. You need to understand that some truths can destroy lives. The town has moved on for a reason. Moved on, I echoed, incredulous. You think pretending it didn't happen is moving on? People deserve to know the truth. If Jake is involved, he deserves a chance to explain. If there's a connection to the Thompsons and Carters, we can't just sweep it under the rug. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, momentarily casting eerie shadows across Hank's face. He seemed to wrestle with his thoughts, and I could see the internal conflict playing out in his eyes. I was there that night, he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But I can't tell you everything. My memory, it's not clear. It's all mixed up in the chaos of that evening. Then help me remember, I urged. If you were there, you must know something. Anything could help piece this together. Hank pinched the bridge of his nose, a gesture of defeat. You want the truth? The truth is messy. It doesn't come without consequences. Bring it on, I said, my resolve hardening. I'm ready for whatever comes next. He looked at me, the weight of his years pressing down on him. You think you are, but you have no idea what you're asking for. The past doesn't just fade away. It clings to you. As the wind howled outside, I felt the walls of the room close in, the tension palpable. What do you mean by that? Pressed. What happened that night, Hank? What do you remember? Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the room was plunged into darkness. My heart raced as I fumbled for my phone, the screen casting a faint glow. Hank, I called out, anxiety pooling in my stomach. Stay calm, he said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. It's just the storm. We'll be fine. But the storm felt more than just a change in the weather. In that darkness, I felt a presence, something lurking just beyond the edges of my vision. I shook my head, trying to dispel the creeping fear. Hank, did you see anything that night? Anything unusual? I saw things I wish I hadn't, he replied, his voice thick with emotion. I saw things that still haunt me. Then tell me, I insisted, my frustration bubbling over. You can't keep hiding behind this wall of silence. I need to know what you saw. A gust of wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Hank leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. There were whispers, Emily, whispers of betrayal and love. I thought I understood what was happening, but it was all so convoluted. The Thompsons, they had secrets, and the Carters, they were angry, desperate. Secrets? I asked, intrigued. What kind of secrets? Love affairs, he said, his eyes distant. Things that could tear families apart. But it wasn't just about love. There was something darker at play. I could feel it in the air that night. A tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. A clap of thunder shook the house, and I instinctively leaned closer to Hank. What do you mean? Was there a fight? Was someone hurt? I don't remember everything clearly, he admitted, frustration tinging his voice. But I remember the clock. It was striking midnight when everything went wrong. I remember the sound of it, how it echoed through the church like a death knell. Why did it stop? I asked, my heart racing. What happened? I don't know, he confessed, his voice trembling, but it felt like a warning, a sign that something terrible was about to occur. I remember running, the sound of chaos behind me, people screaming. I didn't stop until I was far away from that place. The darkness around us felt alive, filled with ghosts of the past desperate to be heard. Hank, you must remember something else, something that could help me understand what really happened. He took a deep breath, his hands shaking. I remember seeing faces, people I knew, but in that moment, they were all distorted by fear and rage. I can't forget the look in their eyes, the way they felt like strangers. Before I could respond, the lights flickered back to life, illuminating Hank's face, which was pale and drawn. Hank, I said softly, if you were so close, then you must know more. There's something you're not telling me. Please, I need you to trust me. He hesitated, the internal battle evident on his face. You're young, Emily. You don't understand the weight of these secrets. They can destroy you. I'm not afraid of the truth, I insisted, determination fueling my words. I'm ready to face whatever comes next, even if it's dark. Hank's gaze softened, and for a moment, I felt the barrier between us crack. The truth has a way of shaping us, Emily, he murmured. It can be a burden or a release, but once it's out there, there's no taking it back. I understand, I said, my voice steady, but I can't let fear dictate my life. If there are secrets that could help me understand what happened to Jake and the others, I need to know them. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the gears turning in his mind. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right, but you need to promise me one thing." "What?" I asked, my heart racing. "Promise me you'll be careful. This is not just a story. It's a part of people's lives, and it can hurt them if it comes to light." "I promise," I said, feeling a swell of determination. "I'll be careful." As we spoke, the storm raged outside, but within the confines of Hank's home, we were cocooned in the weight of our shared history. I could sense that we were on the brink of something monumental, a threshold of truth waiting to be crossed, and I was ready to step through it, no matter the cost. The storm was brewing outside, dark clouds rolling in like an ominous tide. I had just returned home from my unsettling visit to the sheriff's office, my mind racing with the implications of what I had learned. Jake's disappearance weighed heavily on my heart, and a nagging feeling of dread crept into my thoughts. I could feel the electricity in the air, a charged tension that mirrored my anxiety. "Mom!" I called, stepping into the warmth of our living room. The familiar scent of baked goods wafted through the air, but it did little to ease my growing worry. "Have you seen Jake?" My mother looked up from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "No, Emily. I thought he was with you. He's been acting strange lately, hasn't he?" "Strange how?" I pressed, my heart racing. I had noticed Jake's peculiar behavior too, but hearing my mother voice her concern made it all the more real. "Just distant, I guess. He didn't come to the last few gatherings. And when I asked him about it, he just brushed me off." She shook her head, casting a worried glance out the window where the first raindrops began to hit the glass. "I hope he's okay." "Me too." I felt a chill run down my spine. "I'm going to look for him. I have a feeling he might be at the church." "Be careful, Emily. The storm is getting worse." Her voice was laced with concern, but I was already slipping on my raincoat, determined to find Jake. The rain pelted down as I made my way to the old church, each step heavy with unease. The storm seemed to echo my feelings, as if nature itself was warning me against what I was about to do. As I approached the church, the towering steeple loomed like a sentinel, a reminder of the secrets it held within its walls. I pushed open the heavy wooden door, and the familiar smell of aged wood and damp stone enveloped me. The interior was dimly lit, the flickering candles casting shadows that danced eerily across the walls. "Jake!" I called out, my voice trembling slightly against the howling wind outside. The only response was the echo of my own voice bouncing back at me. I walked further into the sanctuary, my heart pounding in my chest. "Jake!" I shouted again, desperation creeping into my tone. I felt a strange presence, as if the very air was thick with unspoken words and hidden truths. I moved toward the back of the church, where the old confessionals stood like sentinels of secrets. As I neared the confessional, something caught my eye. A glint on the floor, a folded piece of paper. I bent down to pick it up, my hands shaking slightly as I unfolded it. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic, and my heart sank as I read the words, "I'm sorry, but I can't be involved anymore. They're coming for me." "Jake?" I whispered, a chill running through me. What had he gotten himself into? My thoughts raced back to the conversations we had shared, the secrets we had uncovered together. Had he known more than he had let on? I felt sick to my stomach at the thought of him in danger. Suddenly, a loud crash of thunder rattled the church, and I jumped, instinctively looking around for any sign of Jake. My instinct screamed for me to leave, but I couldn't just abandon him. My heart was torn between fear and loyalty. "Jake!" I tried again, my voice cutting through the darkness. "If you're here, please answer me." Just then, I heard a noise from the back room, a faint scuffle followed by silence. I hesitated, my breath caught in my throat. What if it was someone else? What if it was Emily? The voice was low and shaky, and my heart leaped as I recognized it. "Is that you, Jake?" I rushed toward the sound, relief flooding through me. "Where are you?" "I'm in here," he called out again, his voice strained. I pushed open the door to the small storage room, and there he was, crouched in a corner, looking disheveled and scared. Thank God, I breathed, stepping inside and closing the door behind me. What happened? Why did you disappear? He looked up at me with wide eyes, his face pale. I had to hide. They were watching me, Emily. I thought I could figure it out, but I didn't know how deep it went. What are you talking about? I felt panic rise within me. Who's watching you? What did you find out? He shook his head, his expression one of desperation. I can't tell you. It's too dangerous. You shouldn't have come here. But I had to find you. I'm worried about you, I insisted, my voice rising in intensity. You can't just pull away like this. We're in this together, remember? Together? He scoffed, running a hand through his hair. You don't understand. This isn't just a mystery anymore. It's real and it's dangerous. I'm not the only one who's been looking into this. There are others, people who don't want the truth to come out. My heart sank. What truth, Jake? What are you hiding from me? He opened his mouth to respond, but just then, a loud bang echoed from the main part of the church, followed by the sound of footsteps. My heart raced. Did you hear that? I whispered, glancing toward the door. Yeah, Jake replied, his voice a mere whisper now. We need to get out of here. We both stood, listening intently as the footsteps grew louder, echoing through the church. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and I instinctively moved closer to Jake, seeking comfort in his presence despite the tension between us. What do we do? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. We can't go out that way, he said, looking around in a panic. We'll have to find another way out. There's an old exit through the back that leads to the alley. Okay, I said, trying to keep my voice steady even as fear clawed at my insides. Lead the way. We slipped out of the storage room, careful to keep our footsteps silent on the wooden floors. Jake led me toward the back of the church, his expression serious and focused. We turned down a narrow hallway, the flickering lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. As we reached the door that led outside, I felt a surge of hope. We're almost there, I whispered, but just as Jake reached for the doorknob, the door swung open, and a figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the stormy night. I froze, my breath caught in my throat as I looked up at the figure. It was Hank, the sheriff. What are you two doing here? He asked, his voice low and gravelly. Sheriff, Jake exclaimed, backing away slightly. We were just what? Hank interrupted, stepping closer. You think you can just waltz in here and poke around? You have no idea what you're getting into. Neither do you. I shot back, my fear morphing into anger. We're trying to find the truth about what happened all those years ago. Hank's expression darkened. Some truths are better left buried, Emily. You don't know who you're dealing with. What do you mean? I pressed, feeling a mix of fear and defiance. Are you saying that the past should remain a secret? People deserve to know the truth. He took a step closer, his voice low and urgent. You don't understand the dangers, both for you and for Jake. There are people who will do anything to protect their secrets. Why should we trust you? Jake asked, his voice shaking with anger. You've been hiding things too, haven't you? You were there that night. Jake, don't, I warned, but it was too late. Hank's eyes narrowed, and I could see a flicker of something dangerous behind them. You think you can confront me? You're just kids playing detective. You have no idea what's at stake, Hank said, his voice rising. You need to leave this alone before it gets worse. Worse, I echoed, feeling the weight of his words. Is that a threat? Because if you're trying to scare us off, it's not working. You think you're brave, don't you? Hank shot back, stepping forward. But bravery won't save you from what's coming. You think you know the truth? You have no idea. Then tell us. Help us understand. I pleaded, desperate for answers. We're not afraid of the truth, Sheriff. He hesitated, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. Just then, another loud crash of thunder echoed through the church, and the lights flickered, plunging us momentarily into darkness. I felt Jake's hand grip mine tightly, and I could sense the tension in the air, thick and oppressive. Get out! Hank finally said, his voice low and filled with an edge of desperation. You don't belong here. Go home, both of you. No, I cried, determination flooding my veins. We're not leaving until we find Jake, until we find the truth. Hank's expression hardened, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow across the sky as I walked towards the old town hall. My heart raced with a mix of anxiety and determination. The weight of the past pressed heavily on my shoulders. I had uncovered pieces of a fractured history, but the truth remained elusive, buried beneath layers of denial and silence. Tonight, I would confront the community that had hidden so much, and I hoped they would finally be willing to talk. I arrived at the town hall and pushed the massive double doors open, the creaking sound echoing off the cold, stone walls. The room was already filled with familiar faces, some of whom had known my family for generations. Their eyes flickered with curiosity and unease as I stepped inside. I took a deep breath, reminding myself of the importance of this moment. I had to bring the truth to light no matter the cost. Emily, I heard a voice call out. It was Mrs. Thompson, a kind, elderly woman with silver hair. She approached me, her hands trembling slightly. I'm glad you're here. I heard about your findings. You have to be careful, dear. Thank you, Mrs. Thompson, I replied, forcing a smile. I appreciate your concern, but I can't back down now. We need to discuss what happened that night. As I looked around the room, I noticed faces I recognized but didn't know well, members of the Thompson and Carter families. The two families at the center of the tragedy that unfolded all those years ago. I could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. They were wary, defensive, and I couldn't blame them. The ghosts of the past had a way of haunting even the strongest of hearts. I climbed the small stage at the front of the room, my heart pounding louder than the murmurs that surrounded me. Thank you all for coming. I began, my voice steady but soft. I know this isn't easy, but I believe it's time we confront the shadows that linger over our town. A murmur rippled through the crowd, and I noticed a few heads shake in disbelief. What do you know, Emily? A gruff voice called from the back. It was Mr. Carter, a man who had always seemed to carry a deep sorrow within him. You're just a kid. You don't understand the weight of this. I may not have lived through it, Mr. Carter, I replied, my heart racing. But I've uncovered the truth about that night. The clock stopped, and so did our ability to talk about it. It's time to break that silence. What truth? An older man, Mr. Johnson, stood up, his face lined with worry. You think you can just waltz in here and stir up old wounds? You don't know what you're getting into. Maybe not, I admitted. But I do know that people died, and their stories deserve to be heard. I found letters, diaries, and a warning that said, perhaps it's best not to dig too deep. What does that tell you? The room fell silent, and I could see the flicker of fear in their eyes. I pressed on, my voice gaining strength. We can't keep living in the shadow of this tragedy. It's affecting all of us. We owe it to the victims and their families to uncover the truth. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, her voice trembling. Emily, you have to understand. Some things are better left buried. There are reasons for the silence. People have families, children. They have lives that could be ruined. But they're already ruined, I exclaimed, frustration boiling over. They've been ruined for decades. Don't you want to know what really happened? Don't you want to honor those we lost? A woman I recognized from the Carter family stood up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Emily, I lost my brother that night. I've spent my life wondering what happened to him. But what if the truth is worse than the lies we've been telling ourselves? Sometimes the truth is painful, I acknowledged gently, but it's also liberating. It's time to stop living in fear of the past. We can't change what happened, but we can learn from it. We can acknowledge it together as a community. The atmosphere shifted slightly, and I could sense a crack forming in their defenses. Mr. Johnson shifted uncomfortably, staring at the ground as though the weight of his secrets was too much to bear. Emily, you don't know what you're asking. You could unleash something terrible. Maybe I could, I responded, my voice softening. But wouldn't it be worth it if we could finally heal? If we could move forward as a town? Suddenly, a deep voice interrupted. It was Hank, the sheriff. He strode into the room, a scowl etched on his face. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his eyes scanning the crowd, landing on me. "Emily, you shouldn't be stirring up trouble. You don't know the danger of what you're playing with." I felt my heart drop. "Hank, I'm just trying to get the truth out. The people in this room deserve to know what happened." He stepped closer, his expression shifting from anger to something more somber. "Sometimes the truth isn't what you think it is. You have to be careful with what you dig up." "Are you saying I should just stop?" I challenged, crossing my arms defiantly. "You're the sheriff. You should want the truth." "Truth can be a double-edged sword, Emily," he replied, his tone warning. "You may think you're ready for it, but I'm not sure anyone here is." The murmurs intensified as the crowd reacted to his words. "What do you know, Hank?" one of the Thompsons shouted. "Why are you protecting her?" Hank held up his hands, trying to calm the chaos. "I'm not protecting anyone. I'm just trying to keep this community safe." "Safe from what?" I pressed, my heart racing. "From the truth. From the consequences," he said, his voice lowering. "You think you want to know everything, but some things are better left in the past. Trust me." I shook my head, feeling the frustration bubbling inside me. "You're afraid, aren't you? You're afraid of what will come out if we dig deep enough." The room fell silent again, and I could see the doubt and fear in their faces. Maybe I was asking for too much. Maybe I was pushing too hard. But I couldn't turn back now. "Look," I said, my voice softer. "I understand that this is painful. I know it's uncomfortable. But isn't it worth it to find peace? To put those ghosts to rest?" An older woman in the front row, who I recognized as Mrs. Carter, wiped a tear from her cheek. "You're brave, Emily, but bravery can be dangerous. You're poking at wounds that haven't healed. We've all lost something." "I know," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "but we can't keep living in fear of the past. We need to face it together." Mr. Johnson stepped forward again, his face a mask of conflict. "Emily, I was there. That night, I saw things I wish I hadn't. I've carried that burden for too long. But I'm afraid of what will come if I speak." "Then let me help you," I urged, feeling a surge of hope. "We can face it all together. You don't have to carry that weight alone." The room was heavy with tension, and I could feel the uncertainty swirling around us. Hank's eyes flickered with something unreadable, and I knew he was caught in the crossfire of loyalty and duty. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mr. Johnson took a deep breath, his voice shaky. "It's not just my burden. It's all of ours. We need to take responsibility for what happened." Suddenly, the air felt electric, as if we were on the brink of something monumental. "Then let's talk," I said, my heart racing. "Let's finally uncover the truth." The room was silent for a moment, and then Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, her voice trembling yet resolute. "If we're going to do this, we need to do it right. We need to make sure everyone here feels safe sharing their stories." I nodded, grateful for her support. "We can create a safe space, a place where we can share our truths without fear." As the crowd began to murmur in agreement, I felt a rush of hope. Perhaps tonight was the night we would finally break the silence that had suffocated us for so long. As I looked around, I saw not just fear, but a flicker of courage igniting in their eyes. "Let's begin," I urged, my heart pounding with anticipation. "Let's honor those we lost by bringing their stories to light." The storm raged outside, the wind howling like a banshee as I stood in the dimly lit living room of Sheriff Hank's office. The old wooden beams creaked ominously overhead, and the flickering fluorescent light seemed to mimic my racing heart. I had just returned from my confrontation with Mr. Johnson, the elderly man who had hinted at deeper secrets buried in the town's past. The air felt thick with tension, a palpable sense of urgency pressing down on me. "Emily," Hank said, his voice low and grave. He was leaning against his desk, his face shadowed in the gloom. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" Some things are better left buried. I met his gaze, defiance coiling in my chest. I can't just ignore what I found. Jake's disappearance, the clues, something is wrong. We can't let the past keep haunting us like this. Hank ran a hand through his thinning hair, his eyes filled with a mix of concern and something else I couldn't quite place. You don't understand. These people, our community, they've been living with this for decades. Digging up old wounds could lead to consequences you're not prepared for. Consequences, I echoed, frustration bubbling to the surface. You mean like the consequences of not knowing the truth? Of living a lie? He sighed heavily, the weight of his years settling visibly on his shoulders. Emily, I've seen what happens when the truth comes out. Tears families apart. It destroys lives. Maybe it needs to be torn apart. I shot back. Maybe the only way to heal is to acknowledge what happened. Hank's expression darkened, and for a moment, I could see the flicker of something behind his eyes. Fear? Guilt? There are things you don't know, he said quietly, almost to himself. Things that once revealed can't be taken back. I pressed on, unwilling to back down. You were there, weren't you? The night of the murder. You must know something. He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. The silence that filled the room was thick, each second stretching out like an eternity. Finally, he looked up, and the weight of his stare made my heart race. Yes, I was there, but my memory of that night is fragmented. It's like trying to piece together a jigsaw puzzle with missing pieces. Then let's put the pieces together, I urged, my voice rising. I need to know the truth, Hank. We all do. He hesitated, a battle playing out on his face. You think you're ready for this? You have no idea what you're asking. I'm asking for clarity, I replied, my voice steadying. For the truth. Another gust of wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and for a moment, I thought I saw shadows shifting in the corners of the room. It was just the storm, I told myself, but the unease gnawed at my insides. Fine, he finally said, his voice resigned. But you need to promise me that if it gets too dangerous, you'll walk away. This isn't a game. I nodded, though I could feel the weight of his words settling over me like a shroud. I promise, but I can't walk away now. As Hank began to recount the events of that fateful night, I leaned in closer, straining to catch every word. It was a party, he started, his voice distant as if he were pulling memories from the recesses of his mind. The Thompsons and the Carters were at odds for years, but there was a truce for that night. They brought the families together, hoping to settle their differences. I could feel the tension in the air thicken as he spoke. But something went wrong. I remember the laughter, the music. Then there was a fight, a heated argument that escalated quickly. I was standing in the corner, watching. I still remember the look on Jake's face. He was scared. Jake was there. I interrupted, my heart pounding. He never mentioned being at the party. Not surprising, Hank muttered, shaking his head. He was just a kid back then, but he must have seen something. You should talk to him. He might remember more than he lets on. I felt a surge of determination. I will, but you need to tell me what you saw. What happened next? Then I heard a scream, he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. A woman's scream. I rushed outside, and that's when I saw her lying there. I felt a chill run down my spine. Who was it, Hank? Lila Carter, he said, his voice strained. She was dead, and the clock, it stopped at that moment. I still remember the sound of it, the eerie silence that followed. Did you see anyone? Did you know who did it? My voice trembled, the weight of the revelation pressing against my chest. He shook his head slowly, his expression haunted. No, I didn't see anything, just chaos. People were running, screaming. I was too late. Too late, I repeated, trying to make sense of his fragmented memories. Didn't you report it? You were the sheriff. I was a deputy back then, he corrected, his voice strained. The sheriff told me to keep quiet. He said it was better for the town if we didn't stir the pot. I was young and scared. I didn't want to lose my job, My place in the community. Your place, I echoed incredulously. You were protecting a murderer. It wasn't that simple, Hank replied, his voice rising defensively. There were powerful people involved. I was just a kid trying to do my job. Do you think Jake knows more than he's letting on? I asked, trying to piece everything together. He's been acting strange, and I found that object in his house. It belonged to one of the victims. Hank's face paled. That's not good. If he's connected to this in any way, it could put him in danger. Danger? I repeated, my pulse quickening. What do you mean? I mean people don't want the truth to come out, he said, his voice urgent. They'll do anything to protect their secrets. You need to be careful, Emily. Just then, a loud crash echoed through the office as the power flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. My heart raced as I fumbled for my phone, the dim light barely illuminating Hank's face, which was now a mask of fear. Hank, I called, my voice trembling. What's happening? I don't know, he replied, his voice thick with tension. Stay close to me. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the howling wind outside. I could feel a sense of dread creeping in, as if the shadows were alive, watching us. And then, I heard them. Sudden whispers, barely audible but unmistakable. Ghostly murmurs that seemed to echo from the past. Emily! Hank's voice was barely a whisper, filled with urgency. We need to get out of here. Now. What about Jake? I asked, fear clawing at my throat. He could be in danger. The less we know, the better, he insisted, but I could hear the tremor in his voice. We can't stay here any longer. As we moved toward the door, the whispers grew louder, swirling around us like a tempest. I felt a chill brush against my skin, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw figures, ghostly silhouettes dancing at the edges of my vision. Emily, Hank shouted, pulling me back as I stumbled. Focus. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of fear. We can't leave Jake behind. He needs us. Hank's expression hardened. We can't risk our lives for someone who may be involved in this mess. We need to think strategically. But what if he's in real trouble? I pressed, my heart racing. What if he knows something that could help us? Then we'll find him, Hank said, determination creeping back into his voice. But first, we need to get to safety. Reluctantly, I nodded. We made our way through the darkened office, the storm raging outside like a beast unleashed. The whispers faded into the background, but the sense of foreboding lingered like a dark cloud over us. As we stepped outside, the rain lashed at us, the wind howling like a wounded animal. I shielded my face against the downpour, my thoughts racing. What was Jake involved in? What did he know? Let's head to the car, Hank shouted over the roar of the storm. We need to regroup and figure out our next move. I glanced back at the sheriff's office, a sense of unease settling in my bones. The past was closing in around us, and I could feel the weight of the secrets we were uncovering. The storm, both outside and within me, was far from over. The storm raged outside as I stood in the dimly lit room, clutching Jake's diary in my trembling hands. The words on the pages swirled around in my mind, each line unraveling a thread of truth I had been desperate to uncover. The air was thick with tension, and I felt as if the very walls were closing in on me, pressing me to confront the reality I had been inching closer to. Emily, you need to put that down, a voice murmured from the shadows. I turned, startled, and found Jake standing just inside the doorway, his figure shrouded in darkness. The flickering candlelight cast a ghostly glow on his face, making his expression unreadable. Jake, I exclaimed, my heart racing. I've been looking for you. I found your diary. It explains everything. I stepped closer, but he held up a hand, a plea for me to stop. Please, Emily, you don't understand. Some things are better left buried. His voice was strained, a mixture of fear and desperation. I do understand. You're connected to this. Your family is part of this nightmare. You're one of them, Jake. You're a descendant of the victims. I could feel the weight of the truth pushing down on me, and I needed him to see it too. That's exactly why you need to stop digging, he said, his tone darkening. You think you're uncovering the truth, but you're just stirring up a hornet's nest. My family, we've lived with this for too long. The truth won't set us free. It will destroy us. Destroy us, I echoed, incredulous. What about those who died? What about the families torn apart? What about the clock that stopped because of it all? You can't just let this continue. The tension in the room crackled like the storm outside, and I could see the conflict warring within him. You don't know what you're asking, Jake finally replied, his voice low and pained. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Then tell me, pleaded. You owe it to them, to yourself, to stop hiding. Hank, he's involved, isn't he? He's been lying to us. I took a step forward, my heart pounding. I saw the way he reacted when I mentioned the clock. He knows more than he's letting on. Jake's expression shifted, a flicker of something like recognition passing over his face. Hank, he was there that night. He saw everything. But he's not the monster you think he is. What do you mean? My mind raced, piecing together the fragments of information I had gathered. He's the sheriff. He's supposed to protect us. Emily, he was just a kid, like me, caught up in something far bigger than himself. The town. It's not what it seems. It never has been. Jake's eyes bore into mine, and I could see the pain etched into his features. If you expose Hank, you're exposing the entire town. They'll come after you. They'll come after everyone. Why are you defending him? I shook my head, feeling the walls of my world begin to crumble. He's hiding behind a badge, Jake. He's complicit in everything that happened. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and I felt a chill creep up my spine. You don't know what it's like to carry that weight, Jake said softly. He's been living with the guilt every day. If you think exposing him will help you find peace, you're wrong. It'll only bring more pain. Maybe that pain is necessary. I shot back, my emotions bubbling to the surface. Maybe it's time for the town to face what it's done. You can't just keep burying it. Emily, he took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. You're playing with fire. If you push too hard, you'll get burned. They're not just going to let you walk away with the truth. They'll do whatever it takes to protect their own. I could see the fear in his eyes, and it both frightened and infuriated me. Who are they? Who are we really dealing with here? The door creaked behind him, and I glanced over my shoulder, my heart racing. We need to go. Now, he urged, urgency lacing his voice. If they find out you're onto something, it won't just be you in danger. Who is they? I pressed, shaking with a mix of fear and determination. People in power, he said, glancing back toward the door. The ones who want to keep the past hidden. The ones who have everything to lose if the truth comes out. At that moment, a loud crash of thunder shook the house, and the lights flickered ominously before plunging us into darkness. I felt my heart lurch as the room around me was swallowed by shadows. Jake, I called out, my voice echoing in the silence. What do we do? Stay close to me, he said, his voice steady even in the chaos. We need to get out of here. I can't let you face this alone. Just as I took a step toward him, the door swung open with a creak, revealing a figure cloaked in shadows. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized the familiar silhouette. Hank, I whispered, my heart racing. Emily, he said, his voice low and gravelly. You shouldn't be here. What do you want, Hank? I demanded, my fear quickly morphing into anger. You've been lying to us. You were there that night. You know what happened. Enough, Hank replied, stepping further into the room, his expression hardening. You think you know everything, but you don't. You have no idea what you're getting into. Then tell me, I shot back. Tell me what happened. Tell me why the clock stopped. The clock stopped because of fear, Hank said, his voice trembling with emotion. Fear of what we'd become. We made choices that night, choices we thought would protect us. But it cost us everything. What did you do? I pressed, feeling a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. Please, he said, glancing at Jake, who stood silently beside me. You don't understand the consequences. The truth will destroy everything. It'll tear apart families, friendships, and lives. You think you can bear that weight? I can bear the truth, I insisted, feeling the fire in my belly. What I can't bear is living in a town built on lies. Hank's gaze hardened. You don't get to decide that, Emily. You don't know what it means to carry the burden of guilt. Trust me, it's a heavy price to pay. Then help me, I urged. Help me expose it. Help me put an end to this cycle of fear and deceit. A moment of silence hung between us, filled with unspoken words and unresolved tensions. Finally, Hank sighed, a weariness settling over him. You don't understand. It's not just about exposure. It's about survival. Jake moved closer to me, his hand brushing against mine. Hank, please. We need to know the truth. If there's a way to make this right, we have to try. I can't, Hank whispered, his voice cracking. I don't know if I can live with the consequences. Not after all that has happened. I felt a surge of frustration. But you have to try. You owe it to the people who suffered. You owe it to the families who never got closure. Closure? Hank laughed bitterly, shaking his head. You think there's such a thing as closure? Not in this town. Not after that night. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, illuminating the room once more. I could see the torment etched across Hank's face, and I felt a flicker of sympathy for him. Tell me what happened that night. Hank? I said softly, feeling the weight of his burden. Please. He hesitated, glancing at Jake, who nodded encouragingly. With a shuddering breath, Hank began to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. It was a night like any other, but the tension between the families was palpable. The Thompsons and the Carters had been at each other's throats for years. That night, it all came to a head. I could feel the atmosphere shift, the weight of his words pulling me under. Go on, I urged. There was a confrontation, he continued, his gaze distant. I remember the shouting, the accusations flying like arrows. It got out of hand. Someone pulled a gun, and it all went downhill from there. Who pulled the gun? I pressed, my heart racing. I don't know, he admitted, his voice shaky. But when the shot rang out, everything froze. The clock stopped, and it felt like time itself held its breath. I glanced at Jake, feeling the tension in the air thicken. And what happened to the victims? Hank's face twisted in pain. They were innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. They didn't deserve what happened to them. But the aftermath, it changed everything. The town turned on each other, and we buried the truth.